Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Andy Wallmeyer, MinnPost publisher and CEO. On behalf of the entire organization, I would like to welcome you here tonight and thank you for taking the time to spend it with us. This is our final MinnPost social of the season. But we will have a season again starting up next year in August or September, so we hope to see you at all of those. Before we get started, a couple of announcements. First of all, can you just raise your hand if this is the first time that you've been to a MinnPost social? I always ask this question. I love that. Thank you, guys. Welcome. For those of you who it is your first time, after every event, we send out a post-event survey. I encourage you, please, all of you in this room, to take out the time to fill it out. It should be less than 5 minutes. We read every comment, and we take them to heart as we try to make it better. So we hope that this event will be better than the one we had here a year ago. Second of all, I wanted to fill you guys in on just a couple of bits of news from MinnPost in the last several months. First of all, one thing, we're very happy to announce that within the last few months, we have surpassed the 3,000 member mark. So it's the first time. Hey! And I do sincerely thank all of you, because the vast majority of people in this room are MinnPost members. We had a great Min Roast, for those of you that weren't there, our 10th anniversary. It was unbelievably the 10th time that we've had that event. I think it was the best yet. Even if you weren't there, I hope you guys have been enjoying the videos we've been posting on our site over the last few weeks. We also launched an absolutely fantastic newsletter, the DC Memo. Who here, raise your hand if you're a DC Memo subscriber. Okay, we should have at least twice as many people in this room as DC Memo subscribers. It's a weekly email. It comes out on Thursday. It's written by MinnPost DC correspondent Sam Brody. And it is just a fantastic wrap-up of what's going on in Washington this week through a very Minnesota lens. I personally found a lot of water cooler things in addition to just keeping up on all the hubbub to take away from that. Speaking of Sam Brody, we should celebrate the fact that he, within the past few months, won a national award for his regional congressional reporting from the Washington Press Club. Yay! So, and specifically, they were talking about his breakdown of the Minnesota sugar beet industry, which was an excellent read in how things actually happen in Minnesota and Washington, D.C. Again, one more piece of evidence to commend the DC Memo. By the way, if you want to sign up for that, there's a clipboard on the front table, and there are cards around as well. We recently received another national award from the Society of Professional Journalists for political commentary for Eric Black. Yay! And though it's too early to say, I think we're going to see a raft of awards coming up in the next several months from the great work that we did last year. I'm really, really proud of our staff. Just fantastic work all the way around. Speaking of our staff, there are lots of them here tonight, far more than the 3 that you're going to see up here. I would encourage you to scan name tags. And if you see a maroon bar that says MinnPost staff, go up and introduce yourself to a MinnPost staff member. That's one of the things that we really value about these events, is it's a great opportunity to meet and have all kinds of conversations with you guys. So if you love our work, tell us. If you have some suggestions, tell us. If you just want to, gossip a little bit, come say hi. Finally, I'd like to issue a couple of thank yous. First of all, I'd like to thank the staff of the Happy Gnome. It's good to be back here for hosting us tonight. Yay. Second of all, I would like to thank all of the MinnPost members, and again, that's most of you in this room. Members, individuals provide more than half of the operating support for MinnPost. So this is not just us. We couldn't do what we do without you. And I'd like to say a special thanks to MinnPost Social Event Series sponsor, Darla Cashian of RBC Wealth Management. Normally, this is the point where I'd invite Darla up here to say a word. She had a conflict tonight, but if she were here, I know she would say that the reason she supports this series, and has so for multiple years, is because she knows that conversations like these, informed, respectful conversations involving people with a lot of different perspectives, are so important to the future of our state and our communities within the state. So with that, I'll bring up the folks that we're all here to see. MinnPost editor Andy Putz.
Am I coming in? Okay.
State politics reporter Briana Bierschbach. And local politics reporter Peter Callaghan. While they're getting up here, one more note of housekeeping. Folks in the back, how is the volume? Can you hear me when I'm talking to you right now? We're good. Okay. A titch more. I'm going to try to do a titch more on the back of the speakers, and we'll take it from there.
Hi, it's me again. We're going to dive right into it because there's a lot going on, and I know we've got limited time. I'll just first say, many of you already know Briana Bierschbach, but for those who don't, she covers the legislature for MinnPost. She has been with us since December of 2013. I got that right? Yes. And Peter Callaghan, who has been with us since August of 2014. Peter covers local government, but he is also our in-house expert on all things mass transit, preemption, CTIB, any other acronym you can think of, pretty much. So there's a lot going on, so what I'm going to do is just let Peter and Briana kind of kick it off by letting you know what just happened and kind of where we go from here. As all of you know, the less I talk at these things, the better. I'm going to be counting on you for your questions. Repeat questions, not statements when we get to that part. But for now, let's get to Peter and Briana. Go ahead, guys.
Well, I was downstairs just before reading a press release and through tweets. Governor Dayton actually just before this started made his decision on the budget bills, which passed on Friday at 3 a.m. in a special session of the legislature. And Dayton's decision was to sign all of those budget bills to avoid a government shutdown, but he did something that was pretty tricky. He vetoed, line item vetoed in the state government bill, the appropriation for the House and the Senate's budget. So he said, if you guys want to be funded for the next few years, you have to come back to the negotiating table on a few key issues, which he outlined in his veto letter, in his line item veto letter, I should say. Those issues include tobacco tax cuts in the tax bill, the estate tax, a business property tax break, which he said is too large into the out years. He also wants to renegotiate a teacher licensure overhaul that was passed into law in the education budget. And he also wants to renegotiate a controversial provision, driver's licenses for illegal immigrants. I think that was a big part of the Real ID debate, whether or not the Department of Public Safety can explicitly bar people who are undocumented in the state from getting a driver's license. The language in statute doesn't explicitly bar it. Democrats said it didn't allow them to, but Republicans wanted it explicitly barred. That was in the public safety bill. He wants that to be discussed. So there's a press conference going on literally right now. I don't know exactly what's being said. I think Dayton has to start, I mean, from here, I think we renegotiate. He has to start renegotiating with the legislature, and that could be weeks and weeks of meetings. It does avoid a government shutdown, though. Most of the budget bills were signed. If they hadn't been by June 30th, the last day of the fiscal year, a lot of state government services would have automatically gone into shutdown mode. So I think it remains to be seen how the Republican-controlled legislature reacts to this. They wanted a lot of these things signed, but I think they also want to fund their staff. So
if you work for state government, good news, unless you're a legislative employee, then it's not so good. So which side's evil geniuses are more geniusy?
I don't know. Well, so Dayton specifically said he was upset about a provision in the tax bill that, oh, nice. There's more mics. Does anyone else need one? Dayton, he was specifically mad. He called it a sneak attack in the tax bill. The Republican legislature put in funding for the Department of Revenue, which isn't usually put in the tax bill. It's a revenue bill that's usually put in the state government finance bill. So he had to either sign or allow go into law the tax bill in order to fund the entire Department of Revenue, which has a lot of employees and collects taxes for the state. So he called that a sneak attack. He called it legislative treachery. And he said in his, he basically did his own version of that by not funding the legislature. So yeah, that's, I think, what Peter is referring to.
Yeah. There was also a line in there in which he said that sneaking these things into bills, sometimes last minute, not letting his staff see the language of bills, destroyed the trust that had been built. I think it was even diminishing, destroyed whatever trust we have built during this session. So with that, they go into special session negotiations. That ought to go well. So my little chunk of this was the preemption bill. And speaking of sort of brilliant but cynical political maneuvers, they negotiated that they would pass this preemption bill, which would preempt local governments from passing their own pay, benefits type working conditions ordinances. And they said, we'll send it to you and you can veto it, okay? Then we've all done our kabuki theater and we've all satisfied our constituencies. Well, they've got somebody on their staff who said, I know, let's put a bunch of stuff in that preemption bill that the governor wants, like the ratification of the state employee contracts, which in this case includes something that employees have been enjoying for many months, which is paid parental leave. In fact, there are certain state employees who are currently on their paid parental leave, and had this provision prevailed, their pay would have stopped in the midst of their parental leave. So he, sort of complimented them on the cleverness of that, but he said, you know what, your opportunity, and the provision for this is them ratifying or not ratifying contracts with public employees that have been passed. So he says your time period for ratifying that ended with the regular session. And by you not acting, you defaulted to ratifying the contracts. So we're going to consider all those provisions to be legal and in place. Thanks for your time. And so if you're a political junkie, which is really a dangerous thing, you've got to admire some of the skullduggery that both the governor and the legislature came up with. I mean, some of it was pretty good. I compliment him on that. My little chunk of this was primarily on that preemption bill. And how many people were here at the LC's pre-session function that Briana put on, talking about session? How many? Do any of you remember a bet that I made with you all? Oh, good. No, my bet was I was so sure that the governor would not sign a preemption bill that I told everybody in that room, which was about the same as this, that I would buy them lunch should the governor sign a bill that preempts local governments. And sorry for y'all, but he did veto the preemption bill. But it was kind of touch and go for a while. I mean, they were tying it to issues that he liked, and he was not during the session saying, absolutely no, I will veto it. He was saying, I'll probably veto it, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to veto it, but there may be things that I want that they're going to give me in exchange for that. So I've been to the bank. I have arranged a small loan, which I now will be able to not take out. So thank you so much.
Does this thing work? Okay, here we go. This works. Great. Let's get to it. Let's get to your questions.
So what's happening with Southwest Light Rail, if anything?
Yeah, it looks actually in very good shape. And you can check your MinnPost tomorrow because we'll have a story on the site tomorrow. This is a very complicated funding deal. But the legislature had proposed throughout the session all sorts of poison pills, since we're on the poison pill theme, to kind of screw the funding for Southwest Light Rail. There was this proposal to dissolve CTIB, which I could get into more detail with if you're desperate. But ironically, defunding and dissolving an agency that was set up to provide regional funding for regional rail. The way to build regional rail now is to dissolve that agency, okay? And real quickly, those 5 counties get a 1/4 cent sales tax. If they're not in CTIB, they can raise a 1/2 cent sales tax. So all the other counties get 1/2 cent. The 5 CTIB counties get a 1/4. Dissolve CTIB. I'm now like Kuchiching, is that how you say it? And so I can raise my sales tax, and Ramsey and Hennepin are going to do that, and they're going to double the revenue for transit. So that revenue will allow Hennepin County to pick up the state share, pick up the CTIB share. The Regional Rail Authority in Hennepin County with the property tax is already a funding partner, and they're going to pay the whole thing themselves. They also have enough revenue to pay Bottineau themselves. They also have enough revenue to pay the Orange Line freeway bus rapid transit system themselves. Ramsey would have enough money that if they ever came up with a way to build a Riverview corridor from downtown to the airport, they'd have enough money. They'd have enough money for the Rush Line. They'd have enough money for the Gold Line. I mean, this is a big funding deal. And the legislature tried to torpedo that. They tried to dissolve CTIB on their own terms. They tried to say Hennepin County can't do anything without a public vote. There were all sorts of things in there, but none of them ended up in the final bills. So tomorrow, CTIB will start the process of dissolving. The counties will start the process of approving the dissolution, passing their higher taxes, just in the 2 counties. The other 3 counties are going to take their quarter, and they'll all sort of go it alone. But there is revenue to do all these things. Can I give you the big but? The big but is if the federal government decides to be a funding partner in the future.
Can I get a follow-up real quick? And you see Hennepin and Ramsey as this is where they want to go. That's what it sounds like I'm hearing.
Meaning that's where the commissioners want to do that? Yes, they've announced that they will support increasing their sales tax in those 2 counties to 50 cents on a $100 purchase, and have sort of parsed out how much revenue that produces and what they can get out of it.
Okay, more questions. I'm coming back here. Somebody better have a question while I'm walking. Come on. You guys have questions? Somebody's got a question.
Did anything happen to the premium relief for people buying health insurance on the individual market?
Yes, early in session they did pass a premium relief bill. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty over what is going to happen with the individual insurance market and federally what's going to happen with the ACA. Ultimately, though, they did preserve a MNsure, and they did provide relief through funding that the state already had to provide relief for people who saw their premiums skyrocket considerably last year. And it took a long time for them to get there, but they did agree to it. They had been negotiating it all winter and after the election, and agreed to it in January, or maybe it was early February. Seems like ages ago.
Yeah, speaking of that, I think, Briana, that happened so long ago. Maybe it might be useful for you to talk about just about some of the things that actually got done. I know we got caught up in the Dayton stuff. The big issues that got accomplished, and maybe some big issues that didn't. You wrote about this recently, so it might be a good way to sort of remind some people.
Yeah, the premium relief was one of the first big accomplishments of the session. They also passed early on, or the legislature passed a reinsurance bill, which is very complicated, and I'll admit healthcare is not my expertise, but it essentially shields healthcare providers from really risky claims and really high claims. So it requires the state to share in some of that burden, and that was an expensive bill. It cost, I think, in total about over $500 million out of the surplus just in the next foreseeable budget, but it will cost more into the future, and there were definitely some problems with that. Dayton didn't sign that bill. And Sunday sales passed, which was something I think we've talked about at these events a lot, and people have talked about a lot for the last few years. I think some people were relieved that they don't have to talk about this anymore. Other people were excited that it made me really excited if you saw what happened with Certix. But it was really interesting to see how that ultimately played into the broader liquor debate later in session. The omnibus liquor bill had a bunch of provisions that dealt with expanding sales on site for breweries and distilleries of their products, and I think a lot of liquor stores who lobbied against expanding Sunday sales said, this is too much harm. We don't know. We already don't want Sunday sales. Now you're going to allow breweries and distilleries to sell more on site. Ultimately, a few of those provisions passed, but not all of them. Distilleries will allow to be open on Sundays. They'll also be able to sell more of their products on site. Same with breweries. But they were going to change. This is kind of wonky, but they were going to change the definition of a small brewer I just don't want to hold 2 microphones. They were going to change the definition of a small brewery to allow more breweries to sell growlers, which didn't ultimately pass. But for the Super Bowl, since Dayton is allowing the tax bill to go into law, they added a provision to that will allow bars in the metro, actually potentially across the state. They might have ultimately changed it to statewide, to be open until 4 a.m. for the weekend of the Super Bowl, if you really want to do that. So those were some of the big
They're coming
things.
from different time zones, so it's still 2 o'clock if you're from the West Coast.
Okay, other questions people have. Here we go.
What ultimately happened with the legislator pay raise issue?
Well, that's a really
who
timely
you
question.
asked. Yeah, right.
Well, since they didn't fund the legislature's budget, I don't know. But I think one of the issues early on, when they passed the state government funding bill, the appropriation for the House and the Senate individually did not show any increase to accommodate the pay raise, which would have been a couple $1 million. It did not include that. The House was very against it. Specifically, Speaker Kurt Doubt was specifically against it. Senator Paul Gazelka was not against it and said it was constitutional. I actually made a bunch of calls about that today. I think now the question is a little up in the air because now the legislature has 0 funding versus having a baseline of funding.
They didn't want a pay raise.
They didn't want, as some of them didn't. I think most of them secretly wanted it, or openly. A lot of people said this is what is constitutional, and legislators, just for some background, haven't had a pay raise since 1999. They currently make, for a part-time job, $31,000 a year. There is per diem, there is lodging expenses and other things on top of it, but the Legislative Salary Council, which was passed on the ballot last year, said that wasn't enough. They basically increased it for inflation, and that was about $14,000. That was a lot of sticker shock for some people. After I wrote a story about it, I can't believe how many emails I got about it, and people thought I had raised legislator pay. For the record, I didn't. I just wrote a story about it, but there was a lot of outrage, and that has seemed to temper it a little bit. And I was actually talking with the Senate author of the legislative pay raise late last week, and he said, I always expected the first time to be really controversial because people are paying attention, because it had been so long since legislators had a raise, but it's become less controversial over time. The Republican Party had a meeting not that long ago where they elected a new chair. They also took up a resolution dealing with the pay raise. And they said they wanted to, as a party, say they wanted to block the pay raise. And the activists in the Republican Party said no, which I thought was fascinating. And I think that it means that this council will kind of become less controversial or less watched or whatever into the future. But as of now, I would say that's something I'm watching. And if they don't fund it, there's definitely the potential for a constitutional legal challenge.
Okay, over here.
Well, first, a comment. You should not stop talking to the bank, because there was a local preemption in the environment bill of the plastic bag ban.
Yes.
But the question...
I'm not buying you lunch for that.
The question is, you hear talk about structural deficit and all of that conversation. How does that relate to the budget that was passed this year?
I would think, certainly some people immediately, when they saw the $650 million tax bill, said this is gonna, it's $650 million in the next 2-year budget. It's much more than that in the tails, which is a wonky word that legislators use to describe the budget in the next 2 years, and the 2 years after that, and the 2 years after that. And it ballooned considerably, which is part of why Dayton is saying now he wants to renegotiate this business property tax increase. Specifically, that one, he said, goes considerably up, the way the legislature wrote it, into the out years. And he's concerned about, when he came in, the state was facing a $6 billion budget deficit in 2011. And that was a pretty nasty battle to get a budget deal, a lot of cuts, went into a 20-day government shutdown. He doesn't want that government shutdown again, but he also doesn't want to see future governors and a future legislature inherit the kind of mess that I think he did when he came into office. So that is specifically why he wants to renegotiate that. Some of the other taxes he felt benefited tobacco companies or the estate tax. Depends on who you ask, but a lot of people believe it benefits the wealthy because those are the ones who have estates. So he didn't think that those benefited the whole state, so we wanted to renegotiate those as well. But I think that is a huge concern for him and for a lot of other legislators looking at the out years.
Can you tell us anything about the water buffer bill, please?
Yes, that was a huge point of contention all session. Republicans wanted to delay the buffer deadline that's in place. There's a one for public waterways or ditches. They're all for public waterways, but one for ditches and one for other waterways this year and then next year. They wanted to delay them by either a year or 2 years. Ultimately, what they agreed to is not delaying them. There is, for some people who already have crops in the ground, it's very specific. There's an 8-month, basically, compliance period. So it's not necessarily delay. It gives you kind of a larger window to comply. So that was the deal they ultimately worked out. And Dayton really put his foot down on that. I mean, I was surprised to see any change because he was pretty serious about not changing that and pretty adamant. In other areas where he wasn't clear, he was very clear that he would veto a bill that included a major delay to that.
Other question?
Isn't there an issue with Dakota County and the dissolution of CTIB?
Yes. Dakota County, speaking of sort of brilliant political moves, Dakota County realized that dissolution required a unanimous vote. And they had already announced that they were leaving CTIB. But the joint operating, or joint, that's not what it's called, joint powers agreement said once you give notice, there's a 3-year period that you have to wait and keep contributing your taxes and keep bearing the burdens of being in CTIB. So Hennepin and the others thought, well, if we let you get out right away instead of waiting till the end of 2018, you'll get your money now, and shouldn't that be a benefit to you? And Dakota said, no, it's not good enough. So the first run at dissolution was supposed to pass in March, and it just failed. But in the meantime, they went back to the table, and earlier this month came up with an agreement. Hennepin essentially gave up some of their revenue from the dissolution, because there's money in the bank, and there's money that will be collected between now and then. In order to get the deal, Dakota got a better deal. And the one thing that's very upsetting to the other 4 counties, particularly Ramsey and Hennepin, is early on, Dakota really wanted the red line. And the red line is the bus rapid transit line that you can get on after you get to the Mall of America, and it takes you down through to Apple Valley. And a lot of the other counties didn't think that was really a regional thing. They thought it was kind of your bus service. But in the spirit of regionalism, and everybody should get a little something out of this because they're paying in, they went ahead and supported the red line. Part of the deal is Dakota does not want to pick up the operating subsidy on the red line that they've been paying up till now, and they wanted the Met Council to pick it up. And the Met Council agreed to that. So a line that most of the other counties didn't want in the first place, Dakota really, really wanted. Now Dakota doesn't want to pay for it anymore. But the benefit to this deal is they will no longer have to use these certificates of participation, which is a borrowing mechanism that comes with interest. And the Met Council was going to issue these essentially like a bond, and then have the debt service on that bond. That was going to be about $9 million a year, right out of their budget. By shifting the construction costs to Hennepin County and that sales tax, they no longer need this borrowing mechanism. So Met Council saves, if you will, $9 million a year. So the $1.3 million operating subsidy for the red line, in the scheme of things, didn't harm them that much. But Dakota's now on board, and they'll start tomorrow.
Yep, right here.
Talk a little bit about the Met Council. Did it survive?
You mean the unelected Met Council?
Yeah, you always have to preface it that way, right?
Particularly, all right, I came here 3 years ago from another state, which will remain nameless. So I'm sort of impressed by...
It's Washington.
Right. This will be the first time ever it's really
maybe it doesn't need to be named. Have you ever thought about that? So there's this phrase that's used here that is not used there, which is, I have an election certificate. And it comes up all the time. People say, well, you know, I have an election certificate, all right? And so it just means I'm elected. I was an elected person. So that comes up a lot in the Met Council stuff. Like, they don't have an election certificate, but I have an election certificate. So I'm going to get me one of those. The Met Council, again, had a lot of stuff thrown at them, including a complete change in the makeup of the council, making it more of a federation of governments. Obviously the Met Council didn't like that. Had that passed, I think the future of light rail could be at risk. Each of the 7 counties in the region was going to get 1 vote. So Scott, 1 vote, Hennepin, 1 vote. The other votes were going to be more population-based because they would come from the 16 districts that are population-based. They're equal size. But the local government elected officials from those areas would get together and elect one of their own to represent them in the council. So Minneapolis touches a couple of them, 2 or 3 different ones. So maybe they get 1 of them, 2 of them. I'm not sure they could hope to get 3 of them. So now you have Hennepin County and Minneapolis with 4 votes on a 28-member council. So now that you know what was going to happen, it didn't pass. That was one of the things that Dayton insisted on in the negotiations, that stuff all go away, and it all went away. Is there even a study? I thought they would.
They did pass a few studies. They're requiring a region-wide report on the future of transit and transit lines. They also want to study metro mobility, which was the cause of a really big shortfall in Metro Transit's budget, which was a huge point of debate this year. They ultimately got $70 million to cover that shortfall, but at first they were not going to give them any of that money. So I think they want to study metro mobility and figure out how to make that more cost effective. Certainly people who advocate for more transit, bus and light rail, said that there wasn't enough funding in the out years and planning in the out years for transit.
And we were speculating today blindly that a lot of the stuff that the Republicans put into early bills and early budgets, they weren't all that serious about. If Dayton had said, yeah, let's do that, they'd have been cool with it. But it really changed the bargaining setup of the session so that it put the Democrats on the defensive, it put Dayton somewhat on the defensive. So victories turned into, I blocked that thing that you wanted to do. And that could have been one of them. I mean, there's certainly members of particularly the Senate and House from the exurbs who really hate the Met Council. There's even some Minneapolis Democrats who really hate the Met Council, but or at least are skeptical and think it should be a little bit differently governed. But they just spent all their time getting stuff out of bills that they had far less time accomplishing something that they wanted. They only had the governor. It's not like they have a lot of power. But when bargaining came toward the end, it was Dayton giving up stuff that they had put into bills in exchange for accepting some other stuff that they had put into bills. Pretty smart, huh?
Yeah, it was a really striking debate. I mean, you went from, I know we had divided government over the last few years, but you went from talking about a gas tax increase and talking about a metro sales tax increase to pay for transit and gas tax to pay for roads and bridges to not talking about that at all. I mean, Dayton all but gave up on that goal the second he saw that he was going to come in with a Republican-controlled legislature. He didn't talk about that. He briefly brought up license tabs increase at the very end because Kurt Dowd had sort of shown he was interested in that at the very end of the previous session, but that fell away very quickly. And it was very interesting to see how the debate over transportation went. I mean, what it has been going on for the last 2 years was not there. It was basically no gas tax increase, no other revenues. You give us this $300 million or more that we want, and you can get status quo on light rail and transit and issues in the metro area. And that's essentially what happened.
Okay, we're going to do one more question, and then we're going to take a short break. So I'm going to go back here. I feel like I've neglected you all. Anybody? You got to have a good one, though, since I've come all this way.
In the tax cut bill, they talked about Social Security. What exactly was that piece? And then a second part of my question is regarding pensions and stability. What happened with, specifically as a retired teacher, TRA?
It kind of came in and out, but
Yeah.
TRA, pensions
Social bill
Security.
and Social Security. There was, I'd have to look up the specific what ultimately landed in the bill, but there is an exemption for Social Security. I think it phases out like slowly over time, and I will look that up and I'll actually find you and give you the specific answer. The pension bill failed. I'm not sure if you saw it was attached to the preemption bill that Dayton promised to veto. So there was no, unless you
Go
have
ahead.
more information.
I do, but I'll let you say it wrong first.
I'm going to let Peter take this one.
Okay. Speaking of good staff work, in that preemption bill, they snuck in, according to the governor, some of these contract ratification provisions that were negotiated with the unions, the state employee unions. One of those provisions, for instance, was that parental leave benefit. So again, the governor sent a letter to the legislature, or at least the management and budget did, and said, sorry, you took too long. That was something that we believe you had to have done in regular session, when regular session ended. So I thought some of those pension provisions were in contract negotiations and were subject to an agreement between the governor, the executive branch, and the unions. He's arguing that those are in place and were not nullified by his veto of the preemption bill.
I think he might be wrong, but I'm not sure. This is the problem.
I've seen some shaking heads,
Yeah,
so this will be interesting.
This is the problem with last minute sort of deals.
The pension bill was not part of, most of it, almost all of it was not part of contract. Okay. So it was vetoed.
It was vetoed, and it needs an agreement between the legislature and the governor. Yes. So pensions did not pass. And this is the second year in a row it didn't pass. Dayton didn't sign the bill last year either over disagreements with the version the legislature passed. There's a big looming pension problem. Minnesotans are living for a very long time, and there's a lot of unpaid, or potentially unpaid liabilities there. So I think that that's going to be something, the tails. I think that's going to be something that we're going to be writing about and looking into more. But this is the problem with trying to explain these complicated process right as like news is breaking. So we'll look into that more.
Did we answer your question? How's Social Security?
I need to look. I need to look at the details. It's part of a very big tax bill, but I will look at that and find you and tell you exactly how it works. But there is a Social Security tax cut, and I believe it's phased in over time. But it does exempt most people from paying those at a certain point, I believe.
MinnPost, individual service on your questions. We're moving along here, people. So I'm going to just kick this off with a question, and then we'll get back to it with your questions. My question is, there has obviously been a talk both nationally and in Minnesota about urban-rural divides that we have written about, or certainly others have. But Briana and Peter, talk a little bit about this notion that there is this great divide between greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities, particularly as it was reflected in this session of the legislature.
Okay, before we do that, we have to say that Briana was right on the pension. Go ahead, talk about it.
Yeah. I was going to throw that one to you. Well, I think I can start by saying, obviously, the election this has been going on for longer than just this last election, but it was definitely highlighted by the results of the last election. I mean, huge divide between urban metro areas and greater Minnesota or greater rural areas of different states in terms of the way they voted. And I think it was interesting. We saw a series of polls come out from the Star Tribune later. I think the most prevailing belief is that legislators exacerbate these tensions versus those tensions actually being real. I think there are certain issues like preemption and like light rail transit that legislators from rural areas feel more strongly about not happening or happening than actual residents in rural areas feel about happening or not happening. But Peter wrote a little bit more about this, so I'll let him expand on that.
Yeah, toward the end of session, there was 2 events happened in the same day. One, Chris Coleman brought together a bunch of mayors from exurbs, but also rural areas of the state to support an increase in local government aid. And their message was, we're elected officials from rural areas that are represented here in St. Paul by Republican legislators. Some of them are Republicans, even though, believe it or not, local government offices in the state are nonpartisan. And they said, we don't feel this animus toward the metro. We're not sure why our legislators feel such animus toward the legislature, because we don't. Do we want parity in roads and bridges funding versus their transit funding? Yes, we want to make sure we're treated fairly, but build all the trains you want as far as they're concerned. And they saw this as a divide that they felt happens once you get to St. Paul and you have to pick a caucus. And suddenly the beliefs you have from home get smudged into a caucus position, and isn't always what you might have thought had you been back home. Jim McDonough was talking to the St. Paul Council about the CTIB dissolution and other issues, and he says, I get around the state. I'm a county elected official. I talk to other county officials all the time. I never get any of that from them. They never talk about you and your damn trains or anything. It doesn't come up. But he says it does come up when he talks to people from essentially the exurbs of the Twin Cities. And this is his diagnosis. I don't have any basis to know whether it's a good one or not, but it sounds okay. That there's an economic competition going on in the Twin Cities between the exurbs and the cities, the more urban areas. And that development, both residential and commercial, is going to go one place or the other. And they see that the policies that are being created are driving that development into the urban areas at the expense of the exurban areas. And he's accurate in that the most hostile Republican legislators toward Met Council and toward transit come from exurban, say, third ring suburbs. So chew on that.
I've said this before, and I will say it again. The only Republican legislator I've ever heard say he likes the trains and likes trains is Dave Senjum from Rochester. And I think he likes riding it around St. Paul, but I think that has changed his mind about it. But it is a really divided issue when you talk about trains in the legislature. And I think it goes back to kind of what Peter was talking about. You join a caucus and you pick a side, and it's not necessarily reflective of the rest of the
that
state.
said, it's a very effective political message during a campaign if you're out of state.
Okay.
Well, but I pay attention to what goes on in transit policy in other states. It's not partisan. It's not polarized in other states. What's different about Minnesota that makes transit so polarized?
That's a really good question. One that I want to get to the bottom of in a story. I can't say I've done all the research, but I have asked a lot of people that. I said, when did this get so controversial? Because when Pawlenty was governor, it wasn't as controversial. I mean, he was a big advocate, I believe, for the North Star Line and other legislators. I might be wrong about that. I wasn't here when Pawlenty was here, but I believe he supported that line and other legislators did. And I also think that Central Corridor, which was kind of going before Southwest, wasn't as controversial. There was always some controversy, but it wasn't like it is now. And I think part of it is sort of nationalization of politics, but I think that that's also oversimplifying the issue. And I wish I had a robust answer, but I hope to answer it more in a story. Peter might have some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a pattern that's that clean and that smooth. It has become part of the Republican catechism of late to be nationally to be opposed to light rail and rail transit. It just has over the last 5 years particularly. California wants to electrify Caltrain, which is their big commuter rail system. It's like a bunch of North Stars. that come in, particularly from the south. And it's really, they're diesel trains right now. They want to electrify it. It's an expensive project. The feds have been supportive of it. And 14 Republican members of Congress from the Bay Area wrote the Department of Transportation urging them to not approve this project. It was purely partisan. And a week ago, when Elaine Chao, the Department of Transportation Secretary, was before the Senate talking to Feinstein and Boxer, and they said, "Why aren't you signing the full funding grant agreement for Caltrain?" She came up with a very illogical response. I'm not going to sign that because only the first chunk of funding is in the budget, and I can't sign that until you have the entire budget appropriated, which for the feds is $600 million. Well, no project in the history of the FTA has ever waited for the entire budget to come aside, because you only give them what they need that year. And it's a 4-year or a 5-year or a 6-year project. No project in the history of the FTA has gotten the entire appropriation on day one. So it was kind of so illogical that this week the FTA said they will sign the full funding grant agreement on Caltrain. Well, why is electric trains controversial? Because it somehow fits into, well, not somehow, it does fit into the high-speed rail proposal in California. In Washington, where I came from, Republicans have of late started opposing the Sound Transit projects that are expanding the light rail system. So I think it is more and more becoming, again, part of this agenda where light rail is seen as super expensive, not worth it per riders, not worth it for economic development. I won't use the phrase that Senator Osmek used about, but he made a sexual reference to a liberal Minneapolitans' love of light rail. So it's more and more a partisan issue, not just here, but in other states as well.
So I'm just curious, it seems like every year, despite all promises of otherwise, the legislature ends like it did this year in like a crashing and burning, doing everything at the last minute. Oh, okay. Is this just the new norm, or is there a reason for this? And also for Peter, I'm just wondering, is it true that you're from Washington?
By the way, that's a guest appearance by the Star Tribune's Andy Mannix. So if anyone has any complaints.
Good question, Andy Mannix from the Star Tribune. I think.
Why don't you ask the Star Tribune reporters?
Right. Even the Star Tribune has to come here to get the real story.
I've written a lot about the chaos at the end of session. It's been like this now for the last, at least as long as I can remember, and that's about 7 sessions back. But it's been particularly bad in the last few sessions. And Republicans came into 2017 and said it's going to be different this year. We are going to move up deadlines for our major budget bills. They're going to be available for the public longer. They're going to be, we're going to have more time for public testimony. And that happened. And then suddenly we got into the deadlock phase, which was when they went into closed door negotiations with the governor, which, note the closed door part. I was one of the people sitting outside of a closed door trying to give any information I could to the public, which was not easy. They would walk out of that closed door many times and say, we're making progress, which doesn't mean anything. Sometimes they would come up with a number, which also didn't mean anything because no one knew what was behind those numbers or what those numbers were attached to. As the end of session progressed and deadlock became more pronounced, even less information came out. And also work seemed to suspiciously only happen after it was dark, which gave a lot of DFL legislators reason to start using in the dark of night, which I don't think a lot of Republicans appreciated, and they wanted it to be a transparency session, but it wasn't. And I don't know the solution. I think they tried to increase bump up deadlines, and that didn't really work. I think some people think you get rid of one of the big problems is omnibus bills, which is a word for a giant package of bills. You basically clump a bunch of related subject matter together into a bill, but that's where all these so-called poison pills pop up, and that's where a lot of things are snuck in, like the provision that funded the Department of Revenue in the tax bill, which isn't normally where the Department of Revenue is funded. So that leads to a lot of political machinations and a lot of problems and a lot of people not being able to track what's happening. And I think some people say get rid of that. Some people say force the legislature to come to an agreement earlier. You can't really do that. The legislature would have to do that. Another possibility is require the legislature to comply with open meeting law and the Data Practices Act. They don't currently. So when Dayton, if they had to comply with the open meeting law, when Dayton and Doubt and Gazelka and a handful of other people would have been behind those closed doors, they would have been violating open meeting laws. If they had been subject to open meeting laws, that would have had to happen in the public. Certainly some people say if they don't go behind closed doors at any point, they would never get done. But I think some people also think if they had to do it in public, they would adjust and figure out a way to do it in public. It's all about adjusting to the realities that you have. And also, we're journalists. We know what it's like to write to deadline. But we also meet our deadlines most of the time. That's not what happened. The special session stretched on for 75 hours, could have been indefinitely. I mean, it seemed at every moment that it was never going to end.
Yeah, I mean, if you're let's say you're Republicans and Democrats and you're bargaining, like the last legislature that had Senate Democrats, you want stuff and they want stuff, and you're bargaining, and you're going to end up having to give up some of the things that you want. If you come into the caucus and you say, I gave up a bunch of stuff you wanted, and they go, but it's only day 2 of the session. You gave in too soon, you gave up too easily. The opposite of that is when you give up or compromise something, it better be the last day of session, or it better be deep into the special session, because you've got those people back in your caucus. I mean, it was no different in Washington State. Even when Democrats had both the House and the Senate, they had different positions. I remember a majority leader of the House who was a Democrat who said, talk about the opposition, the Republicans, the opposition. He said, oh, no. The Republicans are the opposition. The Senate Democrats are the enemy. I mean, there were oftentimes more harsh disagreements between the Democratic legislative bodies because they knew each other too well, perhaps, or the issues were really narrowly drawn. So I'm not sure you could create a legislative system where somehow they would meet all these deadlines unless you had nothing controversial to talk about.
Briana, I sort of teed you up for this. There are approximately 9,000 people running for governor. What does that portend for next year's legislative session?
I'm sorry, say that again. Peter was distracting me.
There's a lot of people running for governor. What is that? I mean, is it going to be worse next year, basically?
I think this maybe was the worst it will get because of the budget. I think that made it, more politically charged. It was interesting, though. Dayton is not running again, but for a part of the session, Dayton had a lieutenant governor who was considering running for governor. And I think when she decided not to do that, Lieutenant Governor Tina Smith, that gave him a little bit more freedom. But we also have a Speaker of the House, Kurt Doubt, who is still weighing a run for governor. And I think a lot of people saw his actions this session motivated by that consideration, specifically Sunday sales, specifically the legislative pay raise issue, specifically some of the very conservative provisions in the budget bills. The House positioned itself as the most conservative entity. The Senate was sort of in the middle, and then there was Dayton. And I think that might have been a natural lay of the political land because they had a stronger majority and because they had a more conservative caucus. But I think a lot of people believe it was also because of Doubt's ambitions to appeal to a much more conservative base in his run. There are a lot of other minority party members who are running, and I think I got a lot of press releases this session. I got a lot of, I'm standing up to this. There are also a lot of mayoral candidates, or a handful of, one mayoral candidate, Ray Dean, who I think at moments definitely was, I felt talking to maybe Minneapolis voters a little bit more than he was talking to the legislature, but there were a lot of issues that affected the city of Minneapolis, and he sort of talked about those. But people pointed out that on both sides, there were definitely some higher ambitions at display. I don't know about the next session. I think there's less at stake, but there is also a lot of stuff that can crop up in a non-budget year. Bonding bills always come up. Sometimes that's the year that constitutional amendments come up, right before an election year. And I do think that is the year that a lot of policy provisions really get discussed. So it'll be interesting to see if that changes the debate.
Okay. Jack.
Would you, whatever happens on the case that came down today at the Supreme Court, affect the problems you've been talking about?
The Rebecca Otto case. Yeah, Rebecca Otto is in court right now fighting a case. The legislature in 2015 passed a law that allows, basically her office audits counties. The law change allows private firms to audit counties, and she argued that ripped a core function of her office, and that is unconstitutional, that the legislature can't mess with the authority of a constitutional office like that. Also, it violated the single subject clause, which is you can't take on unrelated provisions in a large budget bill. This was in the state government bill passed late in 2015, a Republican and a Democratic controlled legislature. She has had a ruling from Ramsey County Court, which didn't say it was unconstitutional. And today the Court of Appeals also upheld that ruling, although they did say it was a core function of the auditor's office to do these audits. And it preserved her ability to sort of come back in and say, after counties have been audited by a private firm, for the auditor to say, hey, wait, let me look at that audit. Let me audit your audit. So that was a really interesting ruling, but it didn't do what she wanted, which was to basically declare this law unconstitutional. So she has said she plans to take it to the Supreme Court, which will be very interesting. The Supreme Court has to first accept that case, which a lot of people think is likely. It'll be really interesting to see what they say. That is her last chance. It's her last stop. She's certainly been criticized by Republicans for using taxpayer dollars for that. That was a big subject of the state government debate over her office, is what funding she was using for that. And I think a lot of people are watching that, specifically for this constitutional argument, but also the single subject rule. You know, what can you actually stuff into budget bills? Is this one of those provisions?
Apparently the answer is anything.
Okay, we got time for a couple more questions here. So I'm going to go here because you guys haven't gotten
I want to come back to this rural-urban divide. So the ex-urban representatives, who are the most conservative, are they actually getting more resources for rural areas? Or is this just show saying this, but in fact, are there more roads and bridges and stuff for rural, for greater Minnesota, not just the experts?
I think when you look at the $300 million bill for transportation, which was funded out of the surplus, a lot of those projects will go out into out-state districts. I think critics of that plan will say that this is just a Band-Aid. This is just a very temporary fix on a huge problem. I mean, I think you look at the needs across the state over the next decade, and it's really small in terms of what it actually covers. I mean, road projects are really expensive too, depending on the project. $300 million does not go as far as I think some people would like it to. And there's also bonding funding that's included in this, and some other things. But I think that the people who criticize this as a temporary solution are probably right. This is going to come back. This is going to come back again and again and again until legislators eventually agree to a gas tax increase, which is, a lot of people have said, it takes years and years and years for that to happen. When it happened in 2008, it hadn't happened for, I believe, 2 decades before that. It took a really long time, and it took an override of Pawlenty's veto to get there. So I think a lot of people assume that that is the kind of thing that will happen in order to raise the gas tax this time. That's a good question. It was $1 million bonding bill, which... Billion, thank you. That's a big difference. $1 billion bonding bill, which is what they wanted to pass last year, but it failed in the chaos of the end of session. And then I think everyone's shown openness. Dayton will propose a bonding bill. He always does. He always proposes more than $1 billion in bonding. He's an advocate of that. Dayton will start the conversation that way, as governors often do. The legislature will depending on their relationship after what's going on right now, either bite on that idea or not. It'll be really interesting to watch that. That'll be kind of one of the big debates next year.
Okay. More questions? Yep, right here.
Oh, can you tell us what happened with the elections? Any changes in election law?
Not huge ones. They were proposing a June primary instead of the August primary. That didn't happen. They were also proposing a provisional balloting system, which also didn't happen. They were also proposing to eliminate basically candidate subsidy programs. That also didn't happen. I'm trying to remember what actually happened. Uniform, that's right. A big, huge change is basically right now the governor can call a special election whenever he wants. These are local. So it would create a day every month when a special election. 5 days a year when a special, and that creates basically a system where people will know and become familiar with when that's happening instead of guessing, and hopefully increase turnout, I would assume, for those. That was a big thing. And also the I voted stickers thing passed. Everyone can get I voted stickers, even if you vote absentee, even if you vote early, you'll get that little red sticker.
What about the funding for voting systems?
Oh, $7 million. Yeah, there was also $7 million to replace outdated election equipment. I think they wanted more, the Secretary of State's office, but I believe it's for local governments about $7 million over the next 2 years, till 2020. I'm glad you're here.
And sitting up front.
Okay.
Speaking of urban rural, what about broadband?
There was money put into broadband, and I'm reaching into the recesses of my brain, and I believe it was 20 million. I need to check. I will check and I will tell you, but I believe that it was actually kind of a quieter debate this year. All session, the governor proposed more funding for broadband. I believe it's 20 million total over the next years. He wanted 100 million.
Yeah, he's proposed 100 million.
He's proposed 100 million, and that's part of a study that had looked at broadband accessibility. So I think a lot of people think it's woefully inadequate, but I believe that was the total. I'm going to check and let you know.
Back on the election, gerrymandering is a topic. Is anyone at the legislature carrying that issue forward?
There are bills to basically. It was a topic of discussion this year. We're a few years away from redistricting, but it's getting closer all the time, and nobody knows who's going to be in control yet when that happens. So everybody's a little scared, even if they have power right now. So it was a discussion. It didn't really get any traction, but the discussion was to create an independent redistricting council, and that's been proposed before. But the opposite response was to solidify in law that it's actually the legislature's responsibility to draw the lines. Neither of those proposals, I believe, went anywhere. It was part of the discussion. I think we're going to hear more about it. Some people argue that redistricting commissions are also partisan, and they go to court in other states as well. It'll be really interesting. It's going to be hard to change. It's always hard to change those institutional things, I found.
Yeah. Be careful of thinking that an independent redistricting commission is independent or better somehow. Washington State, by constitutional amendment, created a independent commission. 4 voting commissioners, 1 appointed by each caucus leader. Okay, they elected a non-voting chair, which must be the worst job in the world, and it takes 3 votes to adopt a plan. So they just horse traded for the entire time. And then you had this ridiculous staff work where they would go down to half of a block as to how many Republican voters are on that block, and they would try to move. And then for fun, I did essentially a Data Practices Act request of all the conversations that went to these 4 commissioners. And you would have these incumbent legislators writing their commissioner saying, I hear John Curley, who is a TV personality, is going to run against me. Here's his address. Can you make sure that he is not in my district? I mean, that went on all the time. Or I looked at the numbers. You're killing me here. I can't win this district. You've got to move more R's or D's into my. It was as phony as hell. And then they would come out and go, "Oh, see how independent we are." So careful what you.
Okay, we're going to do one last question, then we're going to call it a night.
I'd like to ask,
the Northwest.
I'd like to ask about the legacy money. I understand that legacy money was put in the general fund, and I want to know if that's true, or if, and if it is true, is that the way legacy money can be used?
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't think so. I need to check on that. I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but you might be right. There's always a discussion of supplanting versus. I'm not sure if that's the same. I'm gonna have to look. There was a legacy bill. Dayton signed it, and he didn't express, as far as I could, a quick scan of the veto letter, a ton of opposition. But let me look that up and make sure I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Okay, one more. That was quick. That was unexpectedly quick.
So two quick questions. So can you prognosticate on what you expect to come out of the next special session? And then is it too early to declare a winner? Governor Dayton, Dowd, or Gazelka?
Well, if there is a special session, I think we don't know yet really what the legislatures, how they're going to respond to that. Dayton has signed things into law in the past and said, I want to renegotiate that, including the auditor provision that we mentioned, and that didn't really go well, and it didn't change. So the legislature would be out of funding, so I think that would be a problem, and they'll have to figure something out. But I didn't hear the press conference, so you might have to check at MinnPost.com tomorrow more about that. Nice plug. And I do think it's hard to say who is the winner. I actually was talking about this with Peter, because I think you look at, if you judge it by the surplus, there was a $1.65 billion surplus when we came in, and Republicans got reinsurance. They got a $650 million tax bill and a $300 million transportation bill. That ate up a lot of the surplus. Dayton, in terms of dollars, got more funding for education, 2% on the education formula over the next 2 years. Also some for his preschool. But I think a lot of what Dayton did was just defend things he's already passed. Buffers, preschool, just defending current statute and current light rail stations, but also light rail funding. And I think that a lot of his successes this session will be in, he was the goalie, and a lot of people loved to tweet this picture of Dayton when he was an actual goalie back at Yale, I believe, or was it Harvard? Yale. He was an actual goalie. And so that was kind of what people saw as his role this year. I think it's hard to say exactly who will win in the end. I think it's either a historically productive session or a historically disastrous session, depending on which side you ask.
Depending on who's writing your brochure. On the special session, I want to throw this out before we leave. This is nothing that I thought of, but I was privy to a conversation at halftime between Mr. Black and Mr. Davies here. And there is an argument to be made, and I think it's a pretty good argument to be made, that vetoing the funding for the legislature violates the separation of powers that are contained in the constitutions of both state and federal government. And here's why. There's been a tradition, I assume here, it was in Washington State, that you respected, particularly in the budget, each branch of government's funding. The legislature didn't go and cut the governor's office funding. They didn't cut judiciary. You know, the judiciary maybe wanted more money, but they really didn't go after each other's funding. And one reason is, imagine every single year a governor at the end of the budget vetoes the legislative funding and says, you want your money, independent branch of government, come talk to me and give me everything I want. I'm not sure if there was a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, whether people would think that was a good idea going forward. So I think there's a fairly good chance that Republicans will file a constitutional challenge to that before they will submit to a special session.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, yeah, on that uplifting note, we're gonna call it a night. So please give a round of applause and thank you to Peter Callaghan and Briana Bierschbach. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for to Happy Gnome. Andy Wallmeyer, publisher. Do you want to say anything? Do you have any words? Thumbs up. We got. Okay. Thank you all. Have a good night.